The video opens by immediately challenging what the audience thinks they already know. The narrator frames the story not as another recycled allegation, but as something far deeper and far more unsettling. Viewers are reminded that for years, stories surrounding Diddy have circulated quietly in the background of the industry, often dismissed as rumors or exaggerated claims. But this moment signals a shift. The narrator explains that what's coming isn't built on speculation alone, but on first-hand accounts that were buried under fear, loyalty, and silence. The name Q is introduced not as a headline chaser, but as someone who visibly carries trauma, someone whose discomfort has been documented over and over again in interviews where he struggled to even speak. The narrator emphasizes that this isn't about mocking or sensationalizing pain. It's about understanding why someone would stay quiet for decades while clearly unraveling in public. And just as the viewer starts to settle into the story, the narrator hints that what Q endured may only represent a fraction of something much larger, an industry pattern that protected power while silencing those caught inside it. The tone sets the expectation that the story will not follow a straight line, and that the truth may be far darker than anything previously discussed. The narrator shifts focus to Q's prolonged silence, drawing attention to how unusual it is in an era where clout often rewards oversharing. Instead of rushing to tell his story, Q avoided speaking altogether, even when asked directly. The narrator points out that whenever Diddy's name came up, Q's demeanor changed completely. His posture stiffened, his voice trembled, and sometimes he broke down entirely. These moments weren't performative. They looked involuntary, as if his body remembered something his mind struggled to process. The narrator explains that silence like this doesn't come from indifference, but from unresolved trauma. Q wasn't protecting anyone else, he was trying to protect himself. The audience is reminded that trauma doesn't always show up as anger or accusations. Sometimes it shows up as avoidance, confusion, and emotional shutdown. The narrator carefully frames Q not as a victim seeking attention, but as someone who never wanted to relive what happened. And just as that silence becomes more understandable, the narrator hints that loyalty played a major role in keeping Q quiet, leading directly into how his relationship with Diddy began. The narrator explains how Q's connection to Diddy was initially framed as a lifeline. Diddy buying him out of a contract wasn't just a business move, it was portrayed as an act of salvation. In Q's world, gestures like that demanded loyalty in return. The narrator describes how Q internalized this debt, viewing it as something that had to be repaid through obedience, patience, and silence. This loyalty wasn't questioned at first, it was normalized, even celebrated. The narrator highlights how the music industry often blurs the line between mentorship and control, making artists feel indebted for opportunities that should never come with personal costs. Q believed enduring discomfort was simply part of paying dues. The narrator emphasizes how dangerous that mindset can be, especially when power dynamics are uneven. What begins as gratitude slowly turns into obligation, and obligation becomes a leash. By the end of this section, the narrator makes it clear that loyalty didn't protect Q, it trapped him. And just when the audience believes Diddy is the central figure in this dynamic, the story pivots towards someone even closer to Q. The narrator introduces Don Richards not as a side character, but as a pivotal figure. Their relationship wasn't private, it played out publicly and was treated as entertainment. To the outside world, they looked like a successful couple navigating fame together. But the narrator explains that trust within that relationship would later become the most disturbing element of Q's story. Dawn wasn't just a girlfriend. She was someone Q felt safe with, someone who existed outside the power imbalance he had with Diddy. The narrator describes how that trust created vulnerability, and how vulnerability became the entry point for what followed. When Dawn presented something new for Q to try, it didn't feel suspicious, it felt intimate. The narrator carefully avoids graphic detail, instead focusing on intent and perception. Q believed this was a shared experience between partners. What the audience begins to realize, however, is that the situation was never equal. As the narrator hints that Dawn may have been acting under different motivations, the sense of betrayal becomes heavier than the event itself. And just as the tension peaks, the narrator leads directly into the night Q says changed everything. The narrator describes the aftermath of the pill not as a single moment, but as a gap in time, a void where memory should exist but doesn't. Q didn't wake up with clarity, he woke up with panic. The narrator emphasizes the confusion, the fear, and the overwhelming sense that something had happened without consent or understanding. The room, the laughter, the cameras, all of it is described through Q's fragmented recollection. What stands out isn't just the environment, but Q's reaction to it. He wasn't embarrassed, he was terrified. The narrator focuses on the psychological impact of waking up feeling violated without knowing exactly why. This lack of memory becomes its own form of torment, leaving Q questioning his own mind. The narrator makes it clear that the absence of detail doesn't weaken the story, it strengthens it. Trauma often erases specifics while amplifying emotion. As the narrator explains, Q didn't walk away from that night and return to normal life. Instead, he carried it forward, unknowingly, into a long-term breakdown that followed him for years. The narrator shifts into the long-term consequences, explaining that what Q experienced didn't end when the night did. His mental health began to deteriorate rapidly. The narrator lists symptoms not to shock, but to illustrate how deeply affected he was: paranoia, auditory hallucinations, confusion, and emotional instability. Simple tasks became difficult. Memories slipped away. The narrator explains that Q had to relearn parts of himself, relying on doctors and loved ones just to function. This wasn't a temporary spiral, it was a fundamental disruption of his identity. The narrator subtly introduces the idea that what Q took may not have been what he was told, reinforcing the suspicion that the situation was orchestrated. The audience is guided to understand that trauma doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up quietly, over time, dismantling a person piece by piece. And just when Q finally began speaking about his pain, the narrator explains that others felt compelled to respond. The narrator recounts Dawn Richards' public statement with careful attention to its wording. Her denial is firm and absolute, but the narrator points out inconsistencies that immediately raised questions. Dawn referenced behaviors and timelines that Q never publicly confirmed, suggesting knowledge she shouldn't have had. The narrator explains how this detail stood out to viewers, not because it proved guilt, but because it complicated the narrative. Why address actions that weren't mentioned? Why anticipate accusations that hadn't been made? The narrator also notes that the statement didn't remain public for long. Its removal became part of the story, adding another layer of suspicion. Rather than resolving anything, Dawn's response deepened the divide. The narrator emphasizes that this wasn't about proving who was right or wrong, it was about how quickly control of the narrative became the priority. And before the dust could settle, another voice entered the conversation. The narrator describes the resurfacing of a video that many viewers hadn't seen before. In it, Q appears visibly disoriented, struggling to understand his surroundings. The narrator focuses on his body language, the confusion, the fear, the delayed reactions. This wasn't someone pretending.
The narrator explains that no amount of acting could replicate that level of distress. Don's presence in the video, laughing and interacting, takes on a different meaning when viewed through Q's account. The narrator also draws attention to a brief moment involving Diddy that caused the camera to shift suddenly. Nothing is explicitly shown, but the implication is clear enough to unsettle viewers. The narrator makes it clear that the video doesn't need explanation. It speaks for itself. And with that evidence in mind, the narrator leads the audience toward the question that now dominates the conversation.
The narrator closes by stepping back and examining the broader picture. If the public believed Cassie's story, why should Q's be treated differently? The narrator highlights how inconsistently victims are believed, often based on popularity, timing, or narrative convenience. Don is framed not as a simple villain or victim, but as a complex figure who may exist somewhere in between. The narrator poses the final question directly to the audience, not as a call for judgment, but for reflection. Can someone be both manipulated and complicit? Can survival and harm coexist in the same person? The video doesn't provide neat answers. Instead, it leaves viewers with discomfort and the understanding that silence, loyalty, and power have protected the wrong people for far too long.